Hello folks, my name is Mark. This is Why I Hate the World. How you guys doing? So this is a video about the BLM kidnapping, which I'm sure you've all heard about. A quick recap. A couple of, about 4 black teenagers kidnapped a white kid who was mentally ill and tortured him and, beat him and cut him with a knife and chopped off his hair and stuff like that. And, and he was bleeding from the scalp, that kind of thing. But not only did they do this, they also, in their infinite wisdom, decided to live stream it on Facebook, which pretty much guaranteed all of them getting caught. So that's good. They've all been caught, and all 4 of them are facing, decades of prison time, which is awesome. But this has caused a major shitstorm in the media recently, and it's pretty. There's a lot of shit getting flung online. It's I don't know. Nothing like a good old-fashioned hate crime in order to stir up, racism, hatred, and bigotry on the internet. Anyway, so just to kind of start off in general, I have no problem with the idea of hate crimes. That is to say, the idea that, a few extra years gets added to your sentence because the thing you did was, motivated by racial or ethnic hate. I got no problem about that at all, I mean, if it means a guy gets put away for an extra dozen years or something, a guy who's like a racist piece of shit who's just going to end up hurting somebody if he's not thrown in jail, no argument for me whatsoever. Good. I hope these 4 kids get the, book thrown at them, and I hope everybody who engages in shit like this gets the same thing. Now, the problem is that especially when you get something really high profile like this, people tend to lose perspective, right? Because hate crime, it's part of our daily life in the United States. In a culture like, in a country like this, where you have, these racial, especially in a country with a history of the United States of exploitation against people of, color, non-whites, right? And in a country like the U.S., we also have a very large racial element in the United States. So this kind of thing is not unheard of, right? Against all races, against white people. I mean, if you look at the statistics on hate crime, there's no race which is like immune to hate crime. You can say, I mean, it seems to happen, however, overwhelmingly against, African Americans, black people. They're the #1 victims of hate crime. But the other races are not too far behind, Jewish people definitely get, a lot, they're victims in a much higher degree than anyone else. Even white people, somewhere in the area of, between 2008 and 2012, I was just looking at the stats right before this, something in the area of 3,500 reported hate crimes against white people. By contrast, it was 13,000 against African Americans. So that's still a lot of people, You could say that it happens in lower numbers against whites, but it's still, it still happens, okay? And I think that's one positive thing to come out of this, this debacle, this whole torture thing, is that it kind of puts that notion to rest that, that there is no such thing as anti-white racism. You hear that a lot from the SJW crowd. They say, well, I can't be racist against whites because they're in power, blah, 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 blah. Well, I think that this event kind of just puts the nail in the coffin for that. It's like, no, you can be racist against them. In fact, you can kidnap them and beat them and torture them and scream things like, fuck white people, Because, see, the thing is that when you scream that kind of thing while you're beating someone, it kind of gives you the reason why you're doing it, So you could say, all right, well, if this mentally ill kid, if he was Latino, they wouldn't be doing it to him. Okay, if he was Asian, they wouldn't be doing it to him. All right, so yeah, that kind of so that's the thing. It just gives ammunition to it. So every time you hear one of these people say you can't be racist against white people, just link to this video. Say yes, you can. Okay, you can definitely be racist, and that's the problem with. So that's the thing with racism is that if it's unchecked, it can lead to violence like this. The whole reason why we have hate crime in the first place is it was actually a movement. It started in the 80s when the civil rights movement started referring to certain types of crimes as hate crimes, lynchings and things like that. And then in the 90s, there was a guy named, I think his name was Robert Byrd, something like that. I actually got it right here. His name was, let me look that up, James E. Byrd Jr. And that was a pretty high profile case. If you guys don't know that case, you should look it up. Basically, he was a black man, in his 40s, walking home. A couple of white guys in a town down south picked him up, pretending like they were going to give him a ride home. In fact, he knew one of the guys that picked him up. And instead, they beat the crap out of him repeatedly and then chained him up by his feet and dragged him behind their truck for miles and miles. And the thing is that he was alive while they were dragging him. And his head and arm got severed from his body and he finally died. Like, they hit something which caused his head to fucking get ripped off. Right. And that crime was, such a major, sensationalized, right? It was such a major thing that it led to the passage of the federal hate crime bill, right? One of the things that, we need to keep in mind here is that people are going to see this event, especially the alt-right, neo-Nazi assholes out there. They're going to use it as ammunition to say, why their bigoted views are right. And it's already happening. You're starting to see people like, out there using this to defend their racist views, and it's even kind of seeping into the mainstream a little bit. You see it on Fox News. I even saw a video by TJ, the amazing atheist, the other day, which I'm actually subscribed to. I usually find him pretty insightful, but this time it's like, wow, man, he took it a little far, and and I can understand, he and a lot of other people are understandably angry, when they see this kind of thing. And then they see other people on the internet defending it, right? And here's the thing that you got to remember is that, this type of crime, it only encourages people out there who are already hateful to come out and express their hate to begin with, right? That's, it's, this kind of thing happens all the time, but you gotta remember it happens against African Americans to a much greater degree than it does anybody else. Okay, at least that's what's reported. All right, maybe it doesn't, but what gets reported to the authorities is that it's happening to, like I just said, the ratio was like 13,000 to 3,000, and that's only the stuff that gets reported. Now, because I'm starting to see like pretty disturbing shit on the internet. People are saying things like, well, what if this guy Robert Byrd Jr., if that murder would have happened today, we'd have riots in the streets. Not necessarily. People, that's another thing, people confuse hate crimes with police shootings. But you do see riots, we did see a lot of riots over police shootings. Well, the difference being is that when people usually engage in hate crimes, they tend to be civilians. And they also tend to get caught and they tend to go to prison. Whereas police, when they shoot somebody, nothing usually happens to them. That's the big problem with police shootings, right? nothing ever happens to the cops. They get suspended for a weekend, and then the police come back and say, "Oh, we find you. You did nothing wrong, even though you shot a guy who was on the ground with his hands behind his head or whatever." There was a real famous case of that. A guy that claimed he was reaching for his taser, and he reached for his gun and shot the dude on the ground, and nothing happened to him. Or the other case where the one guy was like reading a book in his car, cop shot him. Or the 12-year-old kid who was like, in a park playing with a toy gun. Cop shows up, gets out, within 2 seconds shoots him. Doesn't even say anything to him, whatever. It's stuff like that. Those, people get mad at that kind of thing because nothing happens. There's the police are, 99% of the time they get off scot-free. And not only that, they're still allowed to be police, right? People tend to get angry at that kind of thing. But, your typical hate crime perpetrator, some fucking racist piece of shit who just shoots some dude for no reason, usually they go to prison, and you'll notice that there aren't riots in the streets when the person who is guilty of the crime gets caught and punished. And that's usually what happens during a hate crime. So if you want to talk about, riots and that kind of thing, that's a different video that has a lot more to do with socioeconomic status and what you would consider power in society, right? But the simple fact is that African Americans, the black community, they don't riot every time there's an example of racial violence, every time there's a hate crime. No, but there is a movement against when the police kill people, right? Against the state. That's different than just some dude getting murdered by a couple of skinheads, and then the skinheads like getting caught and put in prison, and just people need to kind of take this shit in perspective because when people have a tendency to kind of just lump it all together and say, and then it feeds that ridiculous kind of white genocide narrative that you get from the fucking alt-right Nazi skinhead assholes, and it's like, no, reality's not like that at all. And I think that's just, I think people just really need to kind of step back and take a deep breath and examine what's really happening, And when shit like this happens, it's like, well, what's really going on? Are there really just armies of black people in the streets raping and killing, and just, targeting white people and all that stuff? Is that what's really going on? Or is it like 4 teenagers kidnapped a guy and now they're in prison, probably for the rest of their lives? Is that what happened? I mean, that's what you gotta keep this stuff in mind, because, you don't want to inflame racial hatred. I mean, we're entering a real dangerous area now, era, especially with this fucking, guy that we just elected president installing fucking white supremacist assholes into the White House. There's going to be a lot of rhetoric flying around there now, and it's going to be, you have to stay, keep your mind sharp and fight it wherever you find it, because it's going to just lead to further deaths. If you don't, stand up, right, when people, regardless of what their race is, when they take something like this as an excuse to spread white supremacy, white superiority, stuff like that, you still gotta stand up against it. Even when it comes to something like this, where it's like, okay, well, these 4 kids are clearly the perpetrators, right, and they need to be punished. That doesn't suddenly mean it's okay to allow hate speech to flourish. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Anyway, adios, folks.